So as you're looking ahead at the second assignment, you might be thinking to yourself, what on earth is a rhetorical analysis and what on earth does Dr. Millett want us to do with it? Well, this video is going to walk you through how to do a rhetorical analysis and get you started on thinking about how to structure your own report and why it's useful and beneficial to be able to do this kind of work. So first, what is not a rhetorical analysis? So a lot of times students are asked to analyze something and they instead substitute an easier task. So a rhetorical analysis is not a summary. It is not a description of the document that you're looking at. You don't want to just quote and quote and quote. And in fact, you actually don't use quotations very often in technical writing. And finally, it's not a discussion of the source's topic. So if you've decided to analyze a report on a particular topic in civil engineering, you don't want to just talk about the topic. These are all things that you might use, however, as evidence to support your analysis, but they're not the primary focus. And that's really the one distinction you want to keep in mind. So if you find yourself summarizing or describing or quoting a whole bunch without really relating it to a specific argument that you're making about the document, then you're not actually doing a rhetorical analysis. Now, the benefit of a rhetorical analysis and being able to use this skill is that it helps you to be able to understand and break down a document and how it works a little better. So a rhetorical analysis instead focuses on the how rather than the what. What you are looking at is how does the author accomplish his or her purpose in this text? What are the tools that he or she uses? And how does that relate to the ways that one can argue or use words in your specific field? Since the goal of the second assignment is to essentially explain to a new reader, someone who's brand new to your field, how writing works, the analysis should allow them to see those tools and why they want to perchance consider how they can acquire those tools to be able to communicate appropriately for their given context. So the focus here is on the text itself. It's not on the document's topic or on other features. Instead, you're looking at how this particular example functions. You want to strive to understand how the author addresses audience or targets an audience and accomplishes a purpose and uses a genre to do those things. So this is where genre theory comes back in a little bit more. You can do a lot of different things to explain the how. So in explaining the how, you want to look at those tools. So what are the tools that your particular author uses to accomplish a purpose? Here's where your own understanding of the text as well as your interview is going to be really beneficial. And you want to focus in on elements such as style. So style would be if they use professional jargon that perhaps somebody outside of their field might not understand. Even if you yourself do not understand the document fully, you can still analyze it. But here you can point out where there's terms that are a little confusing to somebody who's not an expert in the field. You can look at their use of passive or active voice. You can focus on their syntax, which would be sentence structure. How do they structure the sentences? Do they use shorter sentences, longer sentences, etc.? What kinds of words do they use and how do they use those words? Sometimes you might find that your author, for instance, uses language that's more easily understood. Second, you might look at formatting. So we've been talking about document design, and perhaps you start considering the ways that authors format documents to be used by a reader more effectively. So for instance, if you're looking at a scholarly research article from engineering or from sciences, you might notice they use something called the IMRAD structure. IMRAD is Introduction, Methods and Materials, Results, and Discussion. Most published scientific articles use the structure in order to create some consistency among the ways that you communicate knowledge in a scientific field. We'll come back to IMRAD in later in the semester, but if you find yourself using a academic journal article, you might find yourself analyzing the structure, the organization, or the formatting of the document. Format also applies to things like use of headers, use of paragraph breaks, things like that too. You can also analyze visuals. So visuals are a huge part of technical communication. It's something we're going to focus on later in the semester. And you can begin analyzing the ways that your author uses visuals to help communicate their ideas. In one of the models, you'll see that the writer actually analyzed the visuals, and it can be very effective in order to get at how the document works. Another element you can take a look at is the use of source material. How are they citing? How are they referring to sources? Are they quoting very much, which they probably are not? Or are they using paraphrase? For the most part, in technical communication, you'll see that there's references in a document, but often they don't talk about them directly. So that's another thing you can consider. These are just a few of the many tools that you can analyze, and I can help you figure out for your particular document what might be most appropriate. But what you want to focus on is what are the most important tools that the writer is using, and also what seem to be the most important ones for your own reader to understand. And don't pick every single tool you see. Pick just a couple. I would say between 2 to 4. So you can select which ones are the most appropriate and go from there. In order to structure your analysis, you want to follow this formula, essentially. And this is going to look different depending on what you're doing, but we're going to work with this particular structure throughout this week and for the rest of this assignment. There are 3 main parts to an analysis, and actually there's 3 main parts to almost every kind of writing. So your first sentence, which is that topic sentence that we discussed in the style unit, that essentially announces what you're going to focus on. So you have a claim, and then you have evidence to back up that claim, and then you discuss that evidence and how it links to the claim. So starting with the claim, what specifically are you arguing and analyzing about the text? So if you're taking a look at visuals, for instance, you would make some kind of argument about how the author uses visuals to accomplish some purpose or to appeal to an audience. Evidence would then be in the form, or would then be what you're bringing in from the text to support that claim. With using the claim about visuals, you probably should bring in a visual to support your claim. However, you also want to talk about that visual. So don't just drop the visual in and run away. You'll have to, in the third stage, the discussion, directly connect the evidence back to your claim. So you have to demonstrate and show how this thing works. Don't leave it up to the reader to understand or to figure out for themselves. You can never leave anything up to the reader. You have to do the work yourself. So you want to consider the ways that you can clearly link your claim. So you start with a claim, you back it up with evidence in the form of paraphrase or summary, very, very occasionally quotation. This can be either from your text or your interview. And then you discuss how does that evidence back up the claim. So again, a little note about using quotations. If, for instance, you're talking about style, you very likely will include a lot of quotation. However, if you're talking about other things that aren't useful to quote, where a paraphrase or a summary instead can stand in, that's what you want to opt for. In technical communication, we don't use quotations a whole lot just because they're not as useful as other forms of writing. In backing up your claim, you might find yourself needing to add in another piece of evidence and discuss that evidence a little bit more. So you'll repeat the second and third steps as many times as you need to in order to convince your reader. So finally, let's look at an example. This is an analysis of Carolyn Miller's Genre of Social Action. And this is the article that I shared with you that it focuses on how genre works. So it's an academic article in my field, and it has particular features that make it work. And one of those things is that it's, as a formal academic journal article, it has a very particular style that might be alienating to somebody outside of rhetorical studies, but to me is exactly what I'm looking for. So here's my claim. Miller uses a style typical of formal academic journal articles and assumes that the reader will possess the knowledge of both vocabulary and jargon. So she's using very academic language, and she doesn't stop to explain these terms. So I bring in my evidence. For example, Miller says, the semiotic framework provides a way to characterize the principles used to classify discourse according to whether the defining principle is based in rhetorical substance, semantics, form, syntactics, or the rhetorical action the discourse performs, pragmatics. Now, if you're not me, and you're not someone who's a scholar in rhetorical studies, I'm going to guess there's a bunch of words in that sentence that are really confusing. So this is where I start discussing. The reader needs some background knowledge to understand the vocabulary. Additionally, while she could have phrased the idea much more simply, she chooses to use a more complicated style. And then I can go on about in the discussion. I can talk about the background knowledge needed is essentially in linguistics. So semantics, syntactics, and pragmatics are elements of linguistics that focus on how words work. And I can also talk about the complicated style in the sense that it's not shorter, simpler sentences, but it's this really long, sort of more extended sentence that is more typical of academic writing in my field. So you can see there that I've essentially backed up how she's using style to fit in an academic setting. If she explained all these terms, it wouldn't work, and the editors of the journal wouldn't have published her piece. If she spent a bunch of time explaining jargon, it's just not what the reader needs because the reader has the background knowledge already. And it essentially points back to a really particular reader. So this is just one example of analysis, but you can see here I'm not really focusing so much on what she says, but how she does it. And so take a look at those models, review over the model video that I have also posted, and start thinking about what kinds of things you can analyze in your own selected document that help illustrate the way your field works and how writing works to accomplish action in your field.